Hey guys, tonight we slip into the flickering candlelight of medieval Europe, where the air smells of damp stone and fresh-baked bread, and marriage isn't the fairy tale romance you're picturing. You're trudging through a muddy village, dodging chickens, as a young couple exchanges vows under a priest's stern gaze. The crowd's more interested in the free ale than the I do's, and honestly, you're wondering if anyone here believes in love. Spoiler: most don't, and you probably won't survive this era's marital maze without a few shocks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a world where marriage wasn't about heart-fluttering moments but cold, hard strategy. The idea of marrying for love? That's a modern invention you'd be laughed out of town for suggesting. Historians point to the 12th century as when romantic love started creeping into poetry, but for most, marriage was a contract. Think less soulmate, more merger. You're watching a noblewoman, maybe 16, promised to a man twice her age. Her family's land and his title are the real couple here. The mainstream fact is undeniable. Marriage was a tool for alliances, securing wealth, or climbing social ladders. Kings married to end wars, peasants married to share a plow. Love. That was for troubadours, not real life. But here's a quirky tidbit to make you raise an eyebrow. Some medieval folks believed a marriage wasn't valid unless both parties said, "I do," with full consent. Sounds sweet, right? Except consent was flexible. You're a peasant girl, and your dad's promising you to a neighbor for a few goats. You nod, not because you're thrilled, but because saying no means no supper. The church, ever the buzzkill, insisted on consent to make marriages spiritually legit, but in practice, families twisted arms like they were wringing laundry. Historians still argue whether this consent rule empowered women or just dressed up coercion in holy robes. You're walking through a market now, overhearing whispers about marriages gone wrong. The myths we hold, about blissful medieval weddings or knights sweeping maidens off their feet, crumble fast. You picture a blushing bride in a flowing gown, but reality hands you a nervous girl in her best, only dress, bartered for security. Nobles weren't immune either. You're at a castle feast, and the bride's father is haggling over her dowry like it's a horse trade. The groom's barely listening. He's eyeing the land deeds. Marriage was a chess move, and you're learning the board was brutal. Let's pause for a chuckle. Imagine you're a medieval matchmaker, pitching true love to a lord who just wants more cows. He'd probably toss you in the moat. The truth is, marriage myths today, like the idea that everyone wed young and stayed miserably hitched, don't hold up. You're seeing older brides and grooms more often than you'd expect, especially among peasants scraping by. Why rush into marriage when you're both still figuring out how to survive winter? The data backs this. Records from 14th century England show average marriage ages for women hovering around 20 to 25, not the teen brides you imagined. But don't get cozy thinking it was all practical partnerships. You're overhearing a priest lecture about marital debt. Yep, the church said you owed your spouse intimacy on demand. Romantic, right? It's less about passion and more about ensuring heirs, especially for nobles. You're cringing as a wife whispers to her friend about faking a headache to dodge her duty. The church's grip on marriage meant every bedroom detail had a spiritual angle, and you're glad you're just visiting this era. Now, you're strolling past a church where a couple's swearing vows. The crowd's buzzing, but not about love. They're betting on how long this union lasts. Marriages were public, not private, affairs. You're noticing the witnesses, from nosy neighbors to grumpy uncles, all there to make sure the deal's sealed. No sneaky annulments later. This public vibe wasn't just for show, it was legal glue. If you tried to back out, the whole village would drag you back to the altar. Here's another laugh to lighten the mood. Picture you, a medieval villager, trying to explain dating apps to your betrothed. They'd think you're possessed. The reality was, you didn't date, you were matched, often before you could spell objection. But there's a twist. Some couples, especially in towns, met at festivals or markets and sparked a bit of chemistry before the deal was done. Not exactly Romeo and Juliet, but you're surprised to hear a baker's daughter giggle about her betrothed's nice smile. Rare, but it happened. As you wander deeper into this world, you're spotting cracks in the myths. Marriage wasn't always a prison, but it wasn't freedom either. You're a fly on the wall at a noble's wedding, where the bride's forcing a smile while her new husband counts her family's gold. Then you're at a peasant ceremony, simpler but no less calculated, two families pooling resources to survive. The myth of universal misery doesn't fit. Some couples found affection, even if it grew after the vows. Historians still argue whether these unions were more oppressive for women or just equally grim for everyone stuck in the system. You're starting to feel the weight of this world, every choice tied to survival, not sentiment. The air's thick with smoke from cooking fires, and you're hearing a mother warn her daughter, "Marry well, or you're toiling forever." The myths we've inherited, polished by movies and novels, fade as you see the raw mechanics of medieval marriage. It's not about love or even lust, it's about land, lineage, and not starving. And yet, as you watch a young couple steal a shy glance amid the chaos, you wonder if maybe, just maybe, a flicker of something real could survive this mess. Let's wrap this section with a final smirk. If you think modern weddings are stressful, try planning one where forgetting the dowry could start a feud. You're leaving this scene with a clearer view of the myths we've busted. Marriage as a romantic ideal? Not here. But you're curious now, aren't you? What drove these matches, and how did they actually play out? Stick with me, and we'll keep peeling back the layers. You're weaving through a bustling medieval town, the air thick with the scent of fresh hay and simmering stew, as you overhear a heated argument between two families. They're not fighting over love or betrayal, it's about who gets the bigger slice of land in a marriage deal. Welcome to the world of arranged matches, where you quickly learn that happily ever after is less about hearts and more about contracts. You're standing in the shadow of a stone manor, watching a father haggle with a groom's uncle over sheep and a mill. This isn't romance, it's a business pitch, and you're about to see how these deals shaped an entire society. The mainstream historical fact is crystal clear: arranged marriages were the backbone of medieval social order. You're seeing it play out, nobles tying bloodlines to secure alliances, merchants linking shops to double their profits, even peasants swapping daughters to share a plow or a pasture. By the 13th century, records show over 80% of noble marriages in England were arranged to cement political or economic ties. You're watching a baron's daughter, barely 17, betrothed to a rival lord's son to end a border feud. She's not thrilled, but her family's safety depends on it. Love isn't the goal, survival is. Now, for a quirky tidbit that makes you do a double take. In some regions, like parts of 14th century France, families used marriage by capture as a loophole. Picture you're a young man, desperate to marry a girl whose dad won't budge on the dowry. You stage a fake kidnapping, her giggling, you both in on it, and suddenly, the church might bless the union to avoid scandal. It's like a medieval rom-com, except with real swords and angry in-laws. This wasn't common, but when it happened, you bet the village gossips had a field day. Historians still argue whether arranged marriages were a total cage for personal choice or if some wiggle room existed. You're eavesdropping on a merchant's wife whispering to her sister about picking her husband from 3 suitors her father approved. Not exactly freedom, but not a total dictatorship either. The debate rages. Did these arrangements crush individuality, or did clever folks find ways to nudge the system in their favor? You're starting to suspect it's a bit of both. As you wander past a blacksmith's forge, you see a young couple being paraded before the town. Their betrothal was sealed months ago, and now they're stuck in a public spectacle, with neighbors shouting blessings or jeers. Arranged matches weren't just family affairs, they were community glue. You're noticing how everyone, priests, lords, even the local baker, has a stake in this union. A good marriage could mean more trade, more soldiers, or just one less feud. You're chuckling at the thought of your modern friends trying to survive this level of nosy oversight. Imagine your group chat blowing up over your Tinder date's dowry. The mechanics of these arrangements are brutal but fascinating. You're at a noble's hall now, where a scribe's scratching out a marriage contract. It's all about land, titles, and who pays for the wedding feast. The bride's family might toss in a vineyard, the groom's offers a night service. You're wincing as the bride, silent, realizes her future's being traded like a sack of grain. But don't feel too bad, sometimes she's in on the game. You hear her later, negotiating with her mother for a better dress to seal the deal. She's no pawn, she's playing the board too. Here's a light laugh to keep you cozy. Picture you, a medieval parent, trying to sell your son as prime husband material because he can milk a cow faster than anyone. Good luck getting that on a dating profile. But seriously, these deals were high stakes. You're learning that a bad match could tank a family's fortune or spark a feud that lasts generations. In one famous case, a 12th-century English noble's botched betrothal led to a decade-long war over a castle. You're glad you're not signing those papers. Now you're slipping into a quieter scene, a peasant's cottage where a simpler arrangement's brewing. No castles here, just 2 families agreeing to share a field if their kids wed. You're struck by how even the poorest matches were strategic. The couple's young, maybe 20, and you catch them stealing shy glances. Maybe there's a spark, but you know it's the promise of an extra cow that sealed this. The church looms large here too, insisting the vows happen at the church door, not in secret. You're smirking at the priest's stern face. He's less Cupid, more accountant. The social ripple of these matches is wild. You're at a market, hearing how one marriage calmed tensions between 2 rival guilds. Suddenly, there's more wool trading, fewer fistfights. Arranged marriages didn't just bind couples, they stitched society together. You're imagining trying to explain this to your modern pals. Your wedding doubling as a peace treaty? They'd think you're joking. But here, it's dead serious. A single match could shift power, wealth, or even village gossip for years. Let's chuckle again. If you think your family's holiday drama is bad, try navigating a medieval betrothal where forgetting a clause could lose you half your sheep. You're starting to see why these arrangements were so tight. Families planned them years in advance, sometimes before the kids could walk. You're picturing a toddler, engaged, to another toddler across the county, their parents already dreaming of merging farms. It's absurd, but it worked, most of the time. As you drift through this world, you're noticing the human side. Not every match was cold. You're at a village dance, where a betrothed couple sneaks a moment to laugh over a spilled ale. Their parents arranged this, but you see a flicker of real warmth. Maybe they'll be okay. Still, you're uneasy. Arranged doesn't mean forced, but it's rarely free either. You're wondering about the ones who didn't get a say, the ones whose "I do" was more survival than choice. The system's clever, tying everyone together, but you're sensing the cracks where hearts got bruised. Before we move on, one last giggle. Imagine you're a medieval matchmaker, pitching a groom who's great with a pitchfork to a skeptical bride. You'd need charm to pull that off. As you leave this scene, you're carrying a clearer picture of how arranged matches weren't just about two people, they held up an entire world. But what about the age thing? Were they all child brides, or is that another myth? Let's keep walking and find out. You're trudging along a rutted path in a medieval village, the air sharp with a tang of wood smoke and damp earth, as you spot a young woman, maybe 20, nervously adjusting her headscarf. She's about to meet her betrothed, a man her father chose for his steady hands and decent barley crop. You're expecting a child bride, barely out of pigtails, but she's older, weathered by years of spinning wool and dodging her mother's chores. The idea that everyone married as teens? That's the myth you're unraveling now, and you're about to see why age and consent in medieval marriage were trickier than you thought. This world's not what you expected, and you're starting to realize surviving it means rethinking everything you know about "I do." Let's anchor this with a solid fact. Contrary to popular belief, most medieval Europeans didn't marry as young teens. Records from 14th century England, like parish rolls, show women typically wed between 20 and 25, men closer to 25 or 30. You're watching this woman, Agnes, let's call her, who's 22 and only now tying the knot. Why the delay? Her family needed her labor, milking cows, hauling water, before they could spare her. Nobles sometimes betrothed kids younger, even at 12, but actual weddings often waited until their late teens or early 20s. You're relieved, but only slightly. Older doesn't mean free. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you blink. In some parts of medieval Italy, parents could legally betroth their kids as young as 7, but if the child later refused to match, they could break it, provided they shouted their dissent in a public square. Imagine you're a 14-year-old, standing on a crate, yelling, "I'm not marrying him," while the town butcher and baker gawk. It happened, rarely, but you're grinning at the sheer guts it took. The church pushed this consent idea, but you're seeing how it was more theater than power. A kid bold enough to pull that stunt? They'd need a miracle to avoid a family thrashing. Historians still argue whether these consent rules gave people real choice or just masked control. You're at a church door now, where a priest is grilling a nervous couple on their free will. The bride, maybe 19, mumbles her agreement, but you catch her father's glare from the crowd. Was that consent, or just survival? Scholars debate if the Church's insistence on mutual agreement empowered individuals or simply gave families a holy excuse to pressure their kids. You're leaning toward the latter, but you're curious about those who slipped through the cracks. Let's lighten the mood with a chuckle. Picture you, a medieval teen, trying to dodge a betrothal by claiming you're too busy with chores. Your parents would probably trade you for a goat on the spot. But seriously, age mattered differently here. You're noticing younger betrothals among nobles, think 12 or 14, because land and titles couldn't wait. You're at a castle now, where a lord's daughter, 15, is promised to a rival's son. She's not thrilled, but she's been raised for this, trained to smile through gritted teeth. Peasants, though, they waited longer. You're back at Agnes's village, where marrying too young meant one less worker for the harvest. Economics trumped everything. The consent issue gets murkier. You're slipping into a crowded tavern, overhearing a heated debate about a local girl who ran off rather than marry. The church said she had the right to say no, but her family's now shunned, and she's hiding in a convent. You're wincing. Freedom came at a cost. The church's rules sound nice on paper. Both parties had to agree, no force allowed. But you're seeing the reality. Parents, neighbors, even priests leaned hard on kids to agree. You're imagining trying to say no to your dad when he's holding the family's only plow over your head. Good luck. Here's another laugh to keep it breezy. Imagine you're a priest, stuck arbitrating a consent dispute between a bride who claimed she was drunk when she said yes and a groom swearing she was sober. You'd need more than prayers to sort that mess. The truth is, consent was a slippery concept. You're at a wedding now, where the bride's barely speaking, her eyes darting to her mother for approval. The groom's no freer, he's 24, but his father's debts mean he's marrying this girl for her family's mill. You're starting to see how choice was a privilege, not a right. Age differences add another layer. You're back at the castle, where that 15-year-old noblewoman's betrothed is pushing 40. It's not universal, but it's common enough to make you uneasy. Among peasants, you're noticing couples closer in age, like Agnes and her groom, both in their early 20s. Why? Because shared labor meant shared survival. You're chuckling at the thought of a modern dating profile here. Seeking partner must be good at threshing and not die of plague. But the data's clear. Older marriages were practical, especially for the poor, who couldn't afford to lose a worker to early motherhood. The social pressure's intense. You're at a village feast, where the whole community's watching Agnes and her groom swear their vows. If she hesitates, the gossip will bury her. You're feeling the weight of every eye on her, judging, calculating. Marrying too young could mean a weaker household, fewer hands to work, more mouths to feed. You're seeing why families held off. A woman in her 20s was stronger, better able to survive childbirth and keep the farm running. Men waited too, needing enough land or trade to support a wife. You're surprised how practical it all is, less romance than raw math. One last giggle. Picture you, a medieval matchmaker, trying to hype a groom who's only slightly pox-scarred. You'd be out of a job fast. As you leave this scene, you're carrying a new truth. Medieval folks weren't all child brides, and consent was more slogan than reality. You're wondering now about the deals behind these matches, the coins and promises that sealed them. The air's getting colder, the path muddier. Let's keep moving to see what dowries and deals were really about. You're standing in a drafty manor hall, the smell of roasted mutton and beeswax candles filling the air, as a father and a prospective groom haggle like they're at a livestock market. Except it's not sheep they're trading, it's a bride's dowry, the price of her future. You're watching the bride, perched quietly on a bench, her eyes flickering between boredom and dread. This isn't just a wedding, it's a deal, and you're about to dive into the messy, coin-driven world of medieval dowries. Every promise, every coin, every scrap of land matters here, and you're learning fast that love has nothing to do with it. One wrong move, and you might not survive the fallout of a bad bargain. Let's ground this with a mainstream fact. Dowries were the cornerstone of most medieval marriages, especially among the wealthy. By the 13th century, European records showed dowries could include land, livestock, gold, or even rights to a mill, anything to sweeten the deal. You're seeing it now. The bride's father offers 2 acres and a chest of silver, while the groom's side counters with a promise of knightly service. It's not about the couple's happiness, it's about balancing the books. For nobles, a dowry could secure a dynasty. For peasants, it might mean an extra cow to survive the winter. You're marveling at how every marriage was a ledger entry. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you smirk. In some parts of 14th century Germany, dowries occasionally included bizarre items, like a cursed family heirloom or a barrel of pickled herring. Picture you're the groom, staring at a rusty sword your new in-laws swear is enchanted, wondering if you've been scammed. These oddities weren't common, but they show how desperate families could be to seal a match. Sometimes, you're learning, a dowry was less about value and more about signaling commitment, like handing over your weirdest treasure to prove you're serious. Historians still argue whether dowries empowered women or just turned them into bargaining chips. You're watching this bride, let's call her Matilda, as her father boasts about her dowry's size to impress the groom's family. Does it give her leverage, or is she just the wrapping paper for the goods? Some scholars say dowries gave women a stake in the marriage, a kind of financial insurance if things went south. Others argue it reduced them to property, traded like a sack of grain. You're leaning toward the grim side, but you're curious if Matilda's got any tricks up her sleeve. Let's toss in a chuckle to keep things light. Imagine you're a medieval bride, and your dowry's a single very stubborn mule. Your groom's face when he sees it? Priceless. But back to reality. You're noticing how dowries weren't just about money. You're slipping into a peasant village now, where a bride's family might offer a few chickens or a share of next year's harvest. It's humbler, but the stakes feel just as high. If the dowry's too small, the groom's family might walk away, leaving the bride shamed and her family scrambling. You're wincing at the pressure. Every egg counts. The negotiation's intense. You're back in the manor, where the fathers are red-faced, arguing over who pays for the wedding feast. The dowry's not just a gift, it's a contract, often written up by a scribe who's trying not to roll his eyes. You're catching snippets. If the bride dies childless, does the land go back? If the groom's a deadbeat, who keeps the silver? It's like watching a medieval prenup, and you're glad you're not signing it. For nobles, dowries could be massive. Think castles or entire villages. You're picturing a lord handing over a forest just to marry his daughter to a duke's son. Power, not passion, drives this. The peasant side's no less calculated. You're at a village meeting now, where two families are pooling resources. The bride's bringing a loom, the groom's got a plow. Together, they might just survive the next famine. You're struck by how dowries weren't always cash or land. Sometimes it was skills or tools. A weaver's daughter might bring her spindle, making her a walking investment. You're chuckling at the thought of listing expert at churning butter as a dowry perk. Imagine pitching that to a modern date. Here's another laugh. Picture you, a medieval dad, trying to hype your daughter's dowry of 3 really good hens to a skeptical groom. You'd need some serious charm. But the truth is, dowries could make or break families. You're hearing about a case where a bad dowry deal left a family bankrupt, their fields sold to cover debts. The church didn't help much, insisting dowries be reasonable, but rarely stepping in when things got ugly. You're starting to see why everyone obsessed over the details. Mess this up, and you're eating dirt for a decade. Now you're at a wedding feast, the dowry finally settled. The bride's family handed over a small plot, the groom's tossed in some sheep, and everyone's pretending to celebrate. But you're catching whispers. Matilda's brother thinks the groom's family got a steal. Dowries weren't just about the couple. They shifted wealth across generations. You're imagining your modern family arguing over who pays for the open bar, then multiplying that by 100. A good dowry could lift a family, a bad one could sink them. You're feeling the weight of every coin on the table. The social ripple's huge. You're wandering through the village, hearing how Matilda's dowry strengthened ties between two rival clans. Suddenly, there's peace, more trade, fewer brawls. But you're also seeing the dark side. Girls without dowries often didn't marry at all. You're passing a spinster's hut, where a woman, maybe 30, lives alone because her family couldn't afford a dowry. She's not starving, but the village whispers she's cursed. You're wondering how many women got trapped like this, their worth tied to what their family could pay. One last giggle. Imagine you're a groom, realizing your dowry includes a haunted barn. You'd sleep with one eye open. As you leave this scene, you're carrying a new truth. Dowries weren't just gifts. They were the glue of medieval society, binding families, forging alliances, and breaking hearts. But what happened when love tried to sneak into this cold, calculated world? Let's slip into the next village and find out. You're lingering in the twilight of a medieval market square, the air buzzing with a hum of hawkers and the clink of tankards, as you catch a young couple stealing a glance behind a cart piled with apples. Their eyes lock, and for a moment, the world of contracts and dowries fades. You're sensing something dangerous here, love, or at least a flicker of it, daring to challenge the iron rules of duty. In this world, where marriages are forged for land or survival, these two are flirting with rebellion. You're about to see how love and duty clashed, and trust me, it's messier than you'd survive in a heartbeat. The mainstream fact is stark. Romantic love was rarely the basis for medieval marriage, especially before the 13th century. You're watching this couple, let's call them Elena and Thomas, who met at last year's harvest festival. Their families have other plans. Elena's promised to a merchant's son, Thomas to a widow with land. Marriage records from 14th century Europe show over 90% of unions were arranged for practical reasons. Love be damned. You're seeing Elena's father now, dragging her away from Thomas, his voice sharp about obligations. Love's a luxury, and most couldn't afford it. But here's a quirky tidbit to make you grin. In some medieval towns, couples could sneak a clandestine marriage by exchanging vows in secret, no priest needed. Picture your Elena, whispering, "I take thee," to Thomas under a moonlit oak, knowing it's legally binding if you can prove it later. These secret unions were rare and risky. Families could disown you, priests could excommunicate you, but they happened. You're chuckling at the thought of Thomas fumbling his vows, hoping no one overhears. It's romantic, sure, but also a middle finger to the system. Historians still argue whether these rare love matches were acts of defiance or just naive disasters. You're standing by a church now, where a priest is scolding a couple for their unsanctioned vows. Did love give them agency, or did it just trap them in a worse mess? Some scholars say these acts show cracks in the arranged marriage system, letting individuals seize control. Others argue love made things worse. Runaways often faced poverty or exile. You're torn, watching Elena's face as she weighs her heart against her family's wrath. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval dad, catching your daughter mooning over a shepherd instead of her betrothed. You'd probably lock her in the barn with the goats. But seriously, love was a problem. You're at a tavern now, overhearing Thomas tell a friend he's ready to risk everything for Elena. The friend's rolling his eyes. Love's a fool's game when your family needs that merchant's grain. You're feeling the tension. Duty's a heavy chain, and love's a flimsy key. Most couples didn't dare try it. The church didn't help. You're slipping into a sermon where a priest's railing against carnal affection outside marriage. Love's fine, he says, but only after the vows, and even then, it's second to producing heirs. You're cringing as Elena's mother lectures her on marital debt, the obligation to keep her future husband happy, love or not. The church's rules made love a spiritual minefield, and you're glad you're not navigating this. Still, you're catching whispers of couples who defied the odds, like a baker's son and a weaver's daughter who ran off and somehow made it work. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval poet, trying to sell love sonnets in a town where everyone's too busy counting dowry coins. You'd starve. But the truth is, love wasn't invisible. You're at a village dance now, where betrothed couples, even arranged ones, sometimes sparked real feelings. Elena and Thomas are there, sneaking a dance while their chaperones argue over ale. It's not freedom, but it's something. Courtly love, that knight and lady stuff from poems, was starting to creep in by the 12th century, especially among nobles. You're imagining a knight pining for a lady he'll never marry, romantic, but useless. The stakes are brutal. You're following Elena now, as she sneaks a letter to Thomas, hidden in a loaf of bread. If her father finds out, she's done. Maybe sent to a convent, maybe worse. You're seeing why love was dangerous. It threatened alliances, dowries, even peace. In one famous 13th century case, a noblewoman's love match sparked a feud that burned 2 villages. You're wondering how many Elenas and Thomases lost everything for a moment of passion. The system wasn't built for them, it was built for order. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're Thomas, trying to woo Elena with a romantic gift, a slightly moldy apple. Smooth move, buddy. As you drift through this scene, you're noticing how love didn't vanish. It just had to fight dirty to survive. You're at a wedding now, not Elena's, where the bride and groom seem content. Maybe they started as a deal, but you catch them laughing together. Love could grow, like a weed in a crack, but duty was the hammer. You're feeling the pull of both, Elena's heart versus her family's plan. The social cost is clear. You're passing a town square where a crowd's gossiping about a runaway couple. They're outcasts now, their families shamed. Love's not a fairy tale here, it's a gamble. You're thinking about your modern life, swiping right, ghosting, no dowry required, and you're grateful. But you're also intrigued. How did the church, that looming shadow, tighten its grip on these marriages? Let's slip into the next village, where the priests are waiting with their rules and their glares. You're standing outside a stone church, its heavy oak door creaking as a priest in a stiff robe glares at a nervous couple before him. The air's thick with incense, and the faint whiff of wet wool from the crowd gathered to witness a wedding. You're not here for romance, though. This is the church's turf, and you're about to see how it clamped down on marriage like a medieval bouncer checking IDs. Every vow, every gesture, every bedroom detail is under its watchful eye, and you're realizing that saying, "I do," means signing up for a holy rulebook thicker than a castle wall. One misstep, and you might not survive the sermon. Let's nail down a mainstream fact. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had solidified its control over marriage across Europe, declaring it a sacrament that only its priests could oversee. You're watching this couple, let's call them Joan and Robert, swear their vows at the church door, public, not private, because the church wanted witnesses. Records from medieval Europe show that by 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council made church-sanctioned weddings mandatory for Christians. No sneaky backyard ceremonies allowed. You're seeing why. The church wasn't just about souls. It was about power, tying every marriage to its spiritual and legal authority. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you chuckle. In some regions, like 13th century England, couples could get in trouble for fornicating before their official church wedding, even if they were betrothed. Picture your Joan, caught kissing Robert behind the barn, and now the priest's fining you both a penny for anticipating the sacrament. It's absurd, but it happened. Church courts were packed with these cases. You're grinning at the thought of a grumpy priest playing love police, but it shows how tightly the church controlled the path to the altar. Historians still argue whether the church's grip empowered couples or just chained them to dogma. You're watching Joan fidget as the priest quizzes her on her free consent, a rule meant to protect her choice. But her father's looming nearby, and you're not sure how free she feels. Some scholars say the church gave women a voice by insisting on consent. Others argue it was a formality, with priests often siding with powerful families. You're leaning toward the skeptical side, but you're curious if Joan's got any room to push back. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval priest, trying to explain marital debt to a couple who just want to get to the feast. You'd rather be eating pie too. But seriously, the church's rules were relentless. You're slipping into a sermon now, where the priest's lecturing about marriage as a sacred bond to produce children, not chase passion. Love's fine, he says, but only if it serves God's plan. You're cringing as he warns against excessive affection, which sounds like code for having too much fun. The church saw marriage as a leash, not a love story. The control went deep. You're at a village now, where a couple's in trouble for marrying without a priest. They thought their private vows were enough, but the church says no, without its blessing, you're living in sin. You're feeling the weight of this system. Every marriage had to pass through the church's gate, or you risked fines, shame, or worse. In one case, a 14th-century couple was excommunicated for a secret wedding, their kids branded illegitimate. You're glad you're just visiting, not signing up for this holy audit. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval villager, trying to convince a priest your quickie vows in a hayloft were sacred. He'd probably make you scrub the church floor. The truth is, the church's rules shaped every step. You're watching Joan and Robert now, standing at the church door, repeating vows exactly as the priest dictates. No improvisation allowed. This isn't a poetry slam. The public setting's deliberate. Witnesses mean no backing out later. You're noticing the crowd, from nosy neighbors to the local lord, all nodding like this is their business too. The church also policed what happened after the vows. You're sneaking into a confessional, overhearing Joan admit she's dodging Robert's marital debt because she's exhausted from fieldwork. The priest's not sympathetic. He's quoting St. Paul about owing each other intimacy. You're wincing at how personal this gets. The church had an opinion on everything, even bedtimes. It's no wonder couples felt watched. You're imagining trying to explain your modern dating life to this priest. He'd probably faint before you got to situationship. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're Robert, trying to bribe the priest with a chicken to skip the mandatory marriage classes. Good luck with that. As you wander through this scene, you're seeing how the church's rules didn't just control marriage, they controlled society. A good wedding meant a stable village, loyal subjects, and full collection plates. You're at a noble's wedding now, where the bishop's blessing seals an alliance between two feuding families. The church isn't just spiritual, it's political, brokering peace with every amen. The downside's clear. You're passing a woman shunned for marrying against the church's rules. Her husband's a foreigner, and the priest refused to sanctify it. Now she's an outcast, her kids mocked. You're feeling the church's iron grip, squeezing out anyone who didn't fit its mold. But you're also catching glimmers of defiance, couples who whispered vows in secret, hoping to outsmart the system. It rarely worked, but you admire their nerve. As you leave this churchyard, you're wondering how different life was for nobles versus peasants at the altar. Let's head to the next village to compare their weddings. You're weaving through a bustling medieval scene, one foot in a muddy village square where peasants are tossing barley grains for luck, the other in a grand castle courtyard draped in silks and ringing with trumpets. Two weddings are unfolding, one humble, one extravagant, and you're about to see how class split the medieval marriage game wide open. The smell of fresh bread mixes with a tang of wine, but whether you're a peasant toiling for survival or a noble chasing power, the altar's a stage for strategy, not romance. You're learning fast that weddings weren't one-size-fits-all, and surviving this divide means knowing who got the better deal. Let's pin this down with a mainstream fact. Social class dictated every detail of medieval weddings, from the ceremony's scale to its stakes. Records from 14th-century Europe show noble weddings were lavish, often costing a year's income, with feasts, justs, and guest lists longer than a king's tax roll. Peasants, meanwhile, kept it simple. Vows at the church door, maybe a shared ale afterward. You're watching a peasant couple, Alice and John, exchange promises under a priest's rushed blessing, while across the county, a noblewoman's wedding involves a week of banquets and a dowry worth a village. Class didn't just shape the party, it shaped the marriage's purpose. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you smirk, in some rural areas, peasant weddings included a bedding ceremony where the couple was escorted to bed by drunken villagers to ensure the marriage was consummated. Picture your Alice, trying to keep a straight face as your neighbors cheer you into a straw-stuffed bed. Nobles had their own version, but fancier. Think courtiers peeking through curtains to confirm the deed. It's weirdly intrusive, but it shows how everyone, rich or poor, was obsessed with sealing the deal. You're chuckling at the thought of dodging that crowd. Historians still argue whether noble or peasant marriages offered more freedom. You're at Alice's wedding now, where the simplicity feels refreshing. No endless guest lists, just a quick vow and a dance. But her choices were slim. She married John because their families share a plow. Across the valley, the noblewoman's wedding is a spectacle, but she's a pawn in a dynastic chess game, her groom chosen to secure a border. Some scholars say peasants had more wiggle room since their matches were less political. Others argue nobles could negotiate better dowries or annulments. You're not sure who's got it worse, but you're leaning toward pity for both. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a peasant bride, and your fancy wedding gift is a slightly used sickle. Meanwhile, the noble bride's drowning in velvet. The contrast is stark. You're slipping into the castle now, where the noble wedding's a circus, minstrels, roasted swans, and a bishop droning blessings in Latin. The bride, maybe 18, is draped in gold thread, but her eyes are blank. This marriage merges two estates, not two hearts. You're comparing it to Alice's wedding, where the feast is just bread and stew, but the couple's laughter feels genuine. Money buys splendor, not joy. The stakes differ wildly. You're back at the village, where Alice and John's wedding strengthens their family's survival. Their dowry's modest, a few hens, a shared field, but it means they won't starve. In the castle, the noble bride's dowry includes a castle and 20 knights' loyalty, binding two rival lords. You're wincing at the pressure. Her marriage could stop a war or start one. Peasant weddings were about immediate needs. Noble ones were about power plays that could reshape maps. You're imagining explaining this to your modern friends. Your wedding doubling as a geopolitical summit? They'd think you're nuts. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a noble groom, realizing your bride's dowry includes a haunted forest. Good luck sleeping. But seriously, noble weddings were theater. You're watching the bride's procession, with servants tossing coins to the crowd to show off wealth. The church loves this. More donations, more influence. Peasants, though, their weddings were practical. You're back with Alice, noticing how her neighbors chip in food for the feast, a community effort to launch the couple. No one's tossing gold, but the warmth feels real. You're wondering if simpler was better. The church's grip varies too. You're seeing the noble weddings bishop fuss over every vow, ensuring the alliance is God-approved. At Alice's wedding, the priest's more relaxed, still strict, but he's got fields to tend later. Nobles faced tighter scrutiny because their marriages carried bigger consequences. You're recalling that 13th century case where a noble's botched wedding sparked a feud, costing dozens of lives. Peasant marriages rarely caused such chaos, but a bad match could still mean hunger. You're feeling the weight of both worlds, different scales, same trap. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're a peasant guest, sneaking an extra slice of wedding bread, only to get caught by the bride's mom. Busted. As you drift between these scenes, you're seeing how class split weddings into spectacles or necessities. Nobles got pomp, but their marriages were cages of politics. Peasants got simplicity, but their choices were bound by survival. You're curious now about what happened when these marriages didn't work out. Could anyone escape? Let's slip into the shadows of the next village to uncover the world of annulments. You're skulking through a dimly lit monastery, the air heavy with the scent of old parchment and candle wax, as a nervous woman whispers to a scribe about escaping her marriage. Her voice trembles. She's not here for prayer. She's begging for an annulment, a medieval get-out-of-jail-free card that's harder to pull off than you'd think. Outside, the world hums with gossip about failed unions, and you're about to dive into the murky ways medieval folks untied their knots. It's a tangle of church rules, clever loopholes, and desperate gambits, and you're realizing that breaking a marriage was as much a strategy as making one. One wrong move, and you might not survive the scandal. Let's ground this with a mainstream fact. Annulments were the primary way to dissolve a medieval marriage, but they were rare and tightly controlled by the Church. By the 13th century, canon law allowed annulments only for specific reasons, like non-consummation, fraud, or discovering you accidentally married your cousin. You're watching this woman, let's call her Beatrice, plead her case. Her husband's impotent, she claims, and the marriage was never completed. The scribe's skeptical, but records show about 5% of marriages in 14th century church courts ended in annulments, mostly for nobles who could afford the legal hassle. You're seeing why. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you raise an eyebrow. In some cases, couples could get an annulment by proving they were too closely related, even if the connection was absurdly distant, like sixth cousins twice removed. Picture your Beatrice, digging through family lore to claim your husband's great-aunt's uncle shared a grandparent with your cousin's cowherd. It's ridiculous, but it worked sometimes. Church courts loved their genealogical puzzles. You're chuckling at the thought of a priest squinting at a family tree, trying to decide if your third cousin's dog counts as kin. Historians still argue whether annulments offered real escape or just favored the powerful. You're in the monastery now, watching Beatrice's case unfold. She's got a lawyer, a rarity for a merchant's wife, because her family's wealthy enough to push this. Poor peasants. They rarely got this far. Annulments cost money and clout. Some scholars say the system gave women like Beatrice a chance to reclaim their lives. Others argue it was rigged for elites, leaving commoners stuck in bad matches. You're leaning toward the grim side, but you're curious if Beatrice's gamble will pay off. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval lawyer, pitching "we're too related" to a priest who's already dizzy from your family tree diagram. You'd need a miracle. But seriously, annulments were a maze. You're slipping into a church court now, where a nobleman's arguing his marriage is void because his wife lied about her virginity. The crowd's whispering, "Scandal sells better than ale." The church's rules were strict. No divorce, only annulments, which declared the marriage never existed. You're wincing as Beatrice's husband storms in, claiming she's lying to dodge him. It's a soap opera, medieval style. The process was brutal. You're watching Beatrice face a panel of grim-faced clerics, who quiz her on intimate details you'd rather not hear. Non-consummation's a valid excuse, but proving it? Humiliating. Sometimes the church sent inspectors to check. Yes, really. You're glad you're not volunteering for that job. Other grounds included pre-contract, being promised to someone else first, or coercion, but you're seeing how hard it is to prove. Beatrice's claiming she was forced, but her father's testimony could sink her. You're feeling the pressure. She's betting everything on this. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval husband, trying to annul your marriage by claiming your wife's secretly a witch. The priest's face would be worth framing. The truth is, annulments were a rich person's game. You're at a peasant village now, where a woman named Marjorie's stuck with a drunkard husband. She can't afford a lawyer, and the local priest just shrugs. Peasants often escaped through separation, living apart without church approval, but it was risky. You're hearing about a couple shunned for splitting unofficially, their kids mocked as bastards. You're grateful for modern divorce courts. The stakes were high for everyone. You're back with Beatrice, whose case hinges on a witness who saw her husband fail in the bedroom. It's mortifying, but she's desperate. A successful annulment could free her to remarry or return to her family, but failure means disgrace. Nobles had it easier. Think of King Henry VIII, who'd make annulments famous later. You're imagining a noblewoman bribing a bishop to find a loophole, while Marjorie's stuck praying for her husband to fall off a horse. The system's not fair, and you're feeling the weight of it. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're a scribe, recording a lord's annulment plea that his wife's too annoying. You'd be tempted to add, "good luck," in the margins. As you leave this scene, you're seeing how annulments were less about freedom and more about navigating the church's labyrinth. Some, like Beatrice, had a shot. Others, like Marjorie, were trapped. You're wondering now about the youngest brides, the ones who didn't even get a chance to fight. Let's slip into the next village to face their reality. You're stepping into a chilly stone hall, the air tinged with the scent of damp wool and burning tallow, where a girl, barely 14, stands rigid in a too-big gown, her eyes wide as she faces a groom old enough to be her father. The crowd murmurs, not about love, but about the land this marriage will secure. You're diving into the grim reality of child brides in medieval Europe, a practice that's not as common as you might think, but still jarring when you see it up close. These young girls, pawned off in the name of alliances or survival, carry a weight you can feel in your bones, and you're about to learn why this was a truth nobody bragged about. Surviving this world means facing its darkest corners. Let's anchor this with a mainstream fact. Child marriages, while not the norm, did happen, especially among nobles, where girls as young as 12 could be wed to seal political deals. Records from 13th century Europe show noblewomen often betrothed before 15, though many didn't consummate or cohabitate until later. You're watching this girl, let's call her Cecily, promised to a lord to unite two feuding families. Parish rolls suggest only about 10% of brides were under 16, but for nobles, early betrothals were a power move. You're uneasy. Her childhood's over before it really started. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you blink. In some cases, noble families used proxy marriages for child brides, where a stand-in, sometimes a servant, said the vows for the girl. Picture your Cecily, watching a random cousin pledge your life while you're still playing with dolls. It's bizarre, but it let families lock in alliances without dragging a kid to the altar. These proxies were legally binding, and you're chuckling at the thought of a servant fumbling through vows while Cecily sneaks an extra sweetmeat. Weird, but strategic. Historians still argue whether child marriages were exploitative or just pragmatic for the time. You're with Cecily now, her hands trembling as she repeats her vows. Some scholars say these early matches protected girls by securing their future in powerful families. Others call it legalized coercion, stripping them of agency. You're leaning toward the latter. Her pale face says more than any contract. The church allowed betrothals at 7 but required consent at 12, yet you're doubting how much consent a child could give under her father's glare. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval kid, hearing you're betrothed and asking if you can bring your pet goose to the wedding. Good luck with that pitch. But seriously, the reality's grim. You're slipping into a village now, where peasant child brides were rarer but not unknown. A farmer might betroth his 13-year-old daughter to a neighbor's son to merge fields, but most waited. She's more useful weaving or milking than marrying. You're noticing Cecily's noble status makes her a bigger pawn. Her dowry's a castle, a peasant girl's might be a pig. Both are currency, but the stakes feel heavier here. The consequences hit hard. You're watching Cecily move to her husband's manor, where she's expected to run a household despite barely knowing how to sew. Childbirth is the real danger. Records show girls under 16 faced higher risks of dying in labor. You're wincing as her mother whispers about duty, knowing pregnancy could kill her. The church didn't blink. It saw early marriage as a path to heirs, not a risk. You're imagining trying to explain modern child protection laws to these folks. They'd think you're from another planet. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval lord, realizing your 12-year-old bride's more interested in her pony than you. Awkward. But the truth is, these marriages weren't always consummated right away. You're learning some noble families delayed cohabitation until the bride was 16 or older, a small mercy. Still, Cecily's stuck in a strange household, serving a husband who sees her as a contract, not a person. You're hearing whispers of other child brides sent to convents if their grooms died early. Freedom, but at the cost of isolation. The social impact's stark. You're at a feast now, where Cecily's marriage is toasted as a peace treaty between clans. The crowd's cheering, but you're catching her blank stare. Her union stops a war, but at what cost? In villages, you're seeing fewer child brides because peasants needed their daughters' labor longer. A 14-year-old's better at churning butter than birthing babies. You're struck by the contrast. Nobles used kids to build dynasties. Peasants waited for practical reasons. Neither feels like a win for the girls. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're Cecily, trying to negotiate bedtime stories instead of marital duties with your grumpy lord. Tough sell. As you leave this scene, you're carrying the weight of these young lives, pawns in a game they didn't choose. You're wondering now about the women who outlived their husbands, the widows who might have turned the tables. Let's slip into the next village to explore their surprising power. You're slipping into a bustling market town, the air sharp with the scent of fresh herbs and leather, where a woman in a fine wool cloak strides past, her chin high, her steps deliberate. She's a widow, not yet 30, and the whispers trailing her aren't pitying, they're wary. In a world where marriage locks most women into roles as wives or mothers, widows like her hold a rare kind of power, and you're about to see how they played the medieval marriage game differently. With no husband to answer to, she's a wild card, navigating dowries, remarriage, and society's side-eye with a savvy that makes you take notice. Surviving this era's rules takes cunning, and she's got it in spades. Let's pin this with a mainstream fact. Widows in medieval Europe often gained significant autonomy compared to married women or spinsters. By the 14th century, legal records show widows could inherit property, manage estates, or run businesses, especially among the nobility and merchant classes. You're watching this woman, let's call her Isabel, oversee her late husband's textile trade. She's negotiating with a merchant, her voice sharp as she demands better prices. Her husband's death left her a third of his land, a dower guaranteed by law, and she's not wasting it. You're impressed, but you sense the tightrope she's walking. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you grin. In some parts of 13th century France, widows could refuse remarriage by paying a fine called a marchet, essentially buying their freedom. Picture your Isabel, tossing a few coins to the Lord Steward with a smirk, saying, "No thanks, I'm good." It wasn't common, but when it happened, you bet it raised eyebrows. Widows like her could choose solitude, or hold out for a better match, making them some of the era's most independent women. You're chuckling at the thought of her dodging suitors like a medieval bachelorette. Historians still argue whether widowhood was a golden ticket or a gilded cage. You're with Isabel now, as she fends off a pushy suitor who wants her land more than her heart. Some scholars say widows had unmatched freedom, controlling wealth and making choices denied to others. Others point out the catch. Society expected remarriage, and lords or families often pressured widows to wed again to keep alliances tight. You're leaning towards seeing Isabel's power as real but fragile. She's free, but only as long as she plays the game smart. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval suitor, pitching yourself to Isabel, only to hear, "Sorry, my sheep are more charming." Ouch. But seriously, widows were power players. You're slipping into a manor now, where Isabel's managing her late husband's tenants. She's no damsel, she's setting rents, settling disputes, and eyeing a new loom to boost her profits. Widows often kept their dowries from their first marriage, giving them leverage to negotiate better terms if they remarried. You're seeing why men chased widows: land, money, and no pesky father-in-law to haggle with. The flip side's tricky. You're at a tavern, overhearing gossip about Isabel's refusal to remarry. Some call her clever. Others say she's defying God's plan for women. The church loved widows who stayed chaste, maybe joining convents, but frowned on those who flaunted their independence. You're wincing as a priest lectures Isabel about wifely duties in her next marriage. Still, she's got options. Records show some widows ran guilds or lent money, turning their dower into empires. You're imagining trying to keep up with her in a modern boardroom. She'd eat you alive. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval lord, trying to bully Isabel into marrying your nephew, only to find she's outsmarted you with a better deal. Good luck. The truth is, widows could shift the marriage market. You're watching Isabel negotiate a potential remarriage, but she's holding out for a groom who'll let her keep control of her lands. Unlike young brides, she's not a pawn, she's a queen on this chessboard. In one famous 14th century case, a widow named Marjorie Kemp remarried strategically, boosting her family status while keeping her business humming. You're rooting for Isabel to pull it off. The social ripple's huge. You're in the market now, where Isabel's independence inspires younger women but spooks the men. A strong widow could tip local power balances, especially if she controlled key resources like a mill or vineyard. You're seeing why lords pushed widows to remarry quickly. It kept wealth in check. Peasants had less to leverage, but even a farmer's widow might keep a plot or a cow, giving her a say in her next match. You're struck by the contrast. Married women were bound, but widows could bend the rules. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're Isabel's servant, watching her reject a suitor by saying his land's too swampy. Savage. As you leave this scene, you're carrying a new truth. Widows weren't just survivors. They were players, wielding power in a world that rarely gave women any. But what about the promises made before marriage? those binding betrothals. Let's slip into the next village to unravel their weight. You're weaving through a crowded village green, the air buzzing with the scent of fresh-cut hay and the chatter of a betrothal announcement. A young couple stands awkwardly before a priest, their families beaming as if they've just won a prize cow. But you're catching the tension in their eyes. This isn't just a promise, it's a contract tighter than a knight's armor. Betrothals in medieval Europe were no mere engagement party. They were binding deals, often more serious than the wedding itself, and you're about to see how they locked people into futures they couldn't always escape. One slip, and you might not survive the social fallout. Let's anchor this with a mainstream fact. Betrothals, or espousals, were legally binding agreements in medieval Europe, often treated as nearly equivalent to marriage. By the 12th century, canon law held that a public promise to marry, witnessed by others, was enforceable. Break it, and you faced fines, shame, or even excommunication. You're watching this couple, let's call them Emma and William, swear their betrothal before a crowd. Their families have already swapped promises of land and livestock. Records show up to 20% of church court cases in 14th century England dealt with broken betrothals, proof these vows were ironclad. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you smirk. In some regions, like 13th century Italy, a betrothal could be sealed with a suborration ring, a deposit, like putting money down on a horse. Picture your Emma, handed a cheap copper ring by William's dad, who's muttering about securing the deal. If you back out, his family keeps the ring and your dowry's deposit. It's like a medieval prenup with extra pettiness. You're chuckling at the thought of William's dad clutching that ring like it's his life savings, but it shows how betrothals were business, not romance. Historians still argue whether betrothals trapped people or offered a strange kind of agency. You're with Emma now, her face pale as she repeats her promise. Some scholars say betrothals gave couples a moment to negotiate. Emma could, in theory, refuse if she's brave enough. Others argue it was a straitjacket. Families and priests leaned hard to enforce these vows. You're doubting Emma's got much room to wiggle. Her father's already counting the sheep William's family promised. The debate's thorny, but you're sensing the weight of obligation crushing any dreams of rebellion. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're William, trying to impress Emma at the betrothal feast with your famous juggling skills, only to drop an apple on the priest's foot. Smooth. But seriously, betrothals were high stakes. You're slipping into a tavern now, overhearing a man lament his broken betrothal. His fiancée ran off with a tanner, and now he's suing her family for the dowry deposit. Church courts ate these cases up, and you're wincing at the fines. A year's wages for a peasant, pocket change for a noble. Breaking a betrothal wasn't just personal, it was a public scandal. The process was intense. You're back at the Green, where Emma and William's betrothal is sealed with a handshake between their fathers. The priest reads a contract listing dowry terms. Emma's bringing a cow, William's offering a share of his family's mill. You're struck by how public this is. The whole village is watching, ready to gossip if anyone flinches. Betrothals could happen years before the wedding, especially for kids. You're imagining a 10-year-old engaged to a neighbor's son, their parents plotting fields while the kids chase chickens. It's strategic, but you're uneasy about the kids' futures being locked in. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval parent, hyping your son's betrothal by bragging he's great at mending fences. Thrilling. The truth is, betrothals were glue for society. You're seeing how Emma and William's promise calms a feud between their families. Suddenly, there's more grain traded, fewer brawls. But the cost is personal. Emma's whispering to her sister about William's weird laugh, and you're wondering if she's stuck for life. Some betrothals allowed a cooling-off period, but backing out meant legal battles or worse. Think angry in-laws with pitchforks. The church was relentless. You're at a church now, where a priest's lecturing about the sacred nature of betrothals. Breaking one was sin, almost as bad as adultery. You're recalling that 14th century case where a woman was excommunicated for ditching her betrothed. She fled to a city, but her village shunned her family. You're feeling the pressure. Betrothals weren't just promises. They were chains linking families, villages, even kingdoms. Nobles used them to forge alliances, peasants to share resources. You're imagining trying to explain cold feet to a priest. He'd probably make you scrub the altar. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're Emma, trying to delay your betrothal by claiming you're allergic to William's sheep. Good try. As you leave this scene, you're carrying a new truth. Betrothals were the foundation of medieval marriage, binding people before they even reached the altar. But what happened when someone dared to stray after the vows? Let's slip into the shadows of the next village to explore the risky world of infidelity. You're skulking through the narrow alleys of a medieval town, the air thick with the scent of baking bread and the faint musk of secrecy, as you overhear a hushed argument behind a tavern. A woman's voice hisses about a stolen kiss, while a man pleads for silence. Infidelity in this world isn't just a betrayal. It's a high-stakes gamble with consequences that could ruin lives, spark feuds, or land you in a church court. You're diving into the dangerous games of cheating in medieval marriage, where sneaking around was less about passion and more about dodging a very public disaster. One wrong whisper, and you might not survive the fallout. Let's ground this with a mainstream fact. Adultery was a serious offense in medieval Europe, often punished by the church and secular courts alike. By the 13th century, canon law branded infidelity a sin, while local laws could impose fines, public shaming, or even banishment. You're watching a woman, let's call her Marjorie, slip away from a market to meet a charming blacksmith. Her husband's a merchant, always traveling, but if she's caught, she risks losing her dowry or worse. Court records from 14th century England show hundreds of adultery cases, mostly targeting women, with punishments ranging from penance to public whippings. You're tense just watching her glance over her shoulder. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you smirk. In some regions, like parts of 14th century Spain, a cheated husband could demand a public test of fidelity. Think a humiliating ritual where the wife had to swear her innocence before a crowd. Picture your Marjorie, forced to hold a hot iron or recite prayers while the village stares, betting on whether you'll trip over a word. It's absurd, but it happened, and you're chuckling at the thought of Marjorie rolling her eyes through the ordeal, knowing she's outsmarted them so far. These rituals were rare, but show how infidelity was everybody's business. Historians still argue whether adultery laws were about morality or control. You're with Marjorie now, her heart racing as she ducks into the blacksmith's forge. Some scholars say the church's crackdowns protected the sanctity of marriage. Others argue they were tools to keep women in line, especially since men often faced lighter penalties. You're noticing the double standard. Marjorie's husband could flirt with the tavern maid and get a slap on the wrist, but her fling could cost her everything. The debate's heated. Was this about faith or patriarchy? You're leaning toward the latter, but you're curious if Marjorie's got a plan to stay one step ahead. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval gossip, spreading rumors about Marjorie's affair and accidentally telling her husband you're the one who saw it. Oops. But seriously, infidelity was a minefield. You're slipping into a church court now, where a man's accusing his wife of cheating based on a neighbor's tip. The evidence: she was seen laughing with a miller. You're wincing at how flimsy it is, but the crowd's eating it up. Adultery cases were public spectacles, and convictions could mean shaming punishments. Think Marjorie paraded in a dunce cap or worse, branded as a harlot. You're glad you're not on trial. The risks were brutal. You're following Marjorie as she sneaks back home, her face flushed but her alibi ready. She was buying iron for her husband's trade. If caught, she could lose her dowry, her kids, or her place in the community. Men weren't immune either. You're hearing about a knight who slept with a lord's wife and got banished after a duel went wrong. In one infamous 13th century case, a cheating noblewoman's affair sparked a feud that burned a village. You're seeing why infidelity wasn't just personal. It could unravel alliances, families, even towns. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval priest, trying to counsel a couple about fidelity while they're both eyeing the door. Awkward. The truth is, the church was obsessed with policing sex. You're at a sermon now, where a priest's ranting about carnal sin and how adultery threatens God's order. Marjorie's in the back, pretending to pray but probably plotting her next rendezvous. The church demanded fidelity to ensure legitimate heirs, especially for nobles, but you're noticing how peasants faced similar scrutiny. Nobody wanted a bastard muddying inheritance. You're imagining explaining open relationships to this priest. He'd need a week of fasting to recover. The social fallout's intense. You're at the market, where gossip about Marjorie's fling is spreading faster than plague. Her neighbors are shunning her, and her husband's business is taking a hit. Nobody trusts a man who can't control his wife. You're feeling the pressure. Infidelity didn't just break vows, it broke communities. Yet some cheated anyway. You're hearing whispers of secret love letters hidden in bread loaves or trysts in haylofts. Marjorie's not alone. Records show women and men took risks for passion, or sometimes just to feel alive in a world of duty. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're Marjorie's blacksmith, trying to flirt by offering her a really nice horseshoe. Smooth move. As you leave this scene, you're carrying a new truth. Infidelity was a dangerous rebellion against a system that locked love in chains. But how did marriage itself keep people afloat? Let's slip into the next village to trace its role in economic survival. You're trudging through a muddy medieval village, the air thick with the scent of damp straw and simmering pottage, as you watch a young couple barter over a shared plow at their betrothal feast. This isn't about love or even lust. It's about survival, pure and simple. Marriage in this world weaves an economic web, tying families, fields, and futures together in a delicate balance where one bad match could mean starvation. You're diving into how these unions were less about vows and more about keeping the wolf from the door, and you're realizing that in this game, a good spouse was worth more than gold. One misstep, and you might not survive the next winter. Let's anchor this with a mainstream fact. Marriage in medieval Europe was a key economic strategy, pooling resources to ensure survival across all classes. By the 14th century, records show most peasant marriages involved merging labor or assets, like fields, tools, or livestock, to strengthen households. You're watching this couple, let's call them Agnes and Peter, agree to share a cow and a patch of barley land. For nobles, marriages linked estates or trade networks. For peasants like these two, it meant enough hands to harvest and eat. You're struck by how every "I do" was a balance sheet, not a ballad. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you grin. In some English villages, couples sealed their marriage with a hand-fasting ceremony where they'd publicly swap tools, like a spade or a spindle, to symbolize their shared work. Picture your Agnes, handing Peter a slightly bent hoe with a shy smile, while the village cheers like it's a royal wedding. It's oddly charming, but it shows how marriage was a contract for labor, not just love. You're chuckling at the thought of Peter trying to look romantic while clutching a rusty shovel. Historians still argue whether these economic marriages were empowering or oppressive. You're with Agnes now, as she negotiates with Peter's mother over who'll tend the new cow. Some scholars say these unions gave couples a shot at stability, combining skills to thrive. Others argue they trapped people in partnerships where affection was a bonus, not a goal. You're leaning toward the practical side. Agnes seems content knowing she won't go hungry, but you're wondering if she dreams of more than just a full barn. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval matchmaker, pitching Peter as great at plowing fields and not bad with goats. Tinder's got nothing on that. But seriously, the economic stakes were huge. You're slipping into a market now, where Agnes and Peter's marriage means their families can share a mill, cutting costs for grinding grain. For peasants, this was life or death. Two households with one plow might starve. Together, they could plant enough to survive. You're seeing why marriage was a team sport, with whole villages invested in the outcome. The noble side's no less calculated. You're at a castle now, where a lord's daughter weds to merge her family's vineyard with a rival's port. The dowry's massive, land, gold, even a ship, but it's not about her, it's about trade routes. You're wincing as she sits silently, her future traded like a barrel of wine. Records show noble marriages often doubled family wealth or secured military alliances. You're recalling that 13th century case where a bad marriage deal cost a lord his castle to a rival. You're glad you're not signing those contracts. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a peasant groom, bragging your bride's dowry includes the best turnip patch in the village. Swoon-worthy, right? The truth is, marriage was a lifeline. You're back with Agnes and Peter, watching them plan their first harvest together. Their union means more hands for sowing, more grain for winter. For women, marriage often meant leaving home to join a new household, but it also brought security. You're noticing Agnes's quiet confidence. She's not in love, but she's got a roof and a partner who can lift a sack of barley. The church had its fingers in this too. You're at a sermon where a priest's preaching that marriage is for mutual support and heirs, not just passion. He's not wrong. Agnes and Peter's kids will mean more workers for the fields. But you're cringing at his lecture on marital debt, pushing couples to produce those heirs. The church saw marriage as a divine tool for order, but you're seeing it as a practical one for survival. You're imagining trying to explain gig economy to these folks. They'd laugh you out of the village. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're Peter, trying to impress Agnes by promising to build a really nice pig pen. Romance goals. As you leave this scene, you're carrying a new truth. Marriage wasn't just a vow. It was an economic pact that kept society spinning. But what about the weird quirks that made these unions unique across regions? Let's slip into the next village to uncover some bizarre marriage customs. You're wandering through a patchwork of medieval villages, each with its own peculiar spin on marriage, the air alive with the scent of wood smoke and the distant jangle of festival bells. You're brushing past a crowd in one town where a bride's being hoisted onto a cart strewn with flowers, while in another, a groom's dodging apples tossed for luck. These aren't your cookie-cutter weddings. Every region has its own quirky customs, and you're about to uncover the bizarre rituals that made medieval marriages as varied as the lands they were sealed in. Some are charming, some are downright weird, and you're realizing that surviving these traditions might take more than a strong stomach. Let's ground this with a mainstream fact. Medieval marriage customs varied widely across Europe, shaped by local traditions and economies. By the 14th century, records show everything from simple church door vows in England to elaborate multi-day feasts in Italy. You're in a French village now, watching a couple, let's call them Marie and Hugh, tie the knot with a ritual where they share a loaf of bread to symbolize unity. In contrast, you're hearing about German nobles staging mock kidnappings to prove the groom's valor. These differences weren't just flair, they reflected how communities used marriage to define themselves. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you chuckle. In some parts of 13th century Scotland, a wedding custom involved the bride's family hiding her shoes, forcing the groom to find them to prove his worth. Picture your Hugh, crawling under tables while the village laughs, hoping to spot Marie's muddy slippers. If he fails, he might owe a sheep as a forfeit. It's absurdly playful, but you're grinning at the thought of Hugh tripping over a drunk uncle in his quest. These rituals were about community bonding, not just the couple, and they made weddings unforgettable spectacles. Historians still argue whether these customs were joyful celebrations or subtle ways to reinforce control. You're with Marie and Hugh now, as the village cheers them sharing that bread. Some scholars say these rituals gave communities a sense of identity, letting even peasants feel part of something bigger. Others argue they were social traps, pressuring couples to perform for approval under the church's watchful eye. You're leaning toward the festive side. Marie's laughing as Hugh fumbles with the loaf, but you're noticing the priest nearby, making sure every step follows canon law. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval guest, trying to join the shoe-hiding game but accidentally stealing the bride's only pair. Oops. But seriously, these customs were wild. You're slipping into an Italian town now, where weddings often lasted days, with dances, feasts, and even poetry contests. The bride's family might parade her dowry, chests of linens, maybe a goat, through the streets to show off. You're comparing it to Marie's simpler French rite, where the bread-sharing feels intimate but still public. Every region had its flex, and you're marveling at the creativity. Some customs get weird. You're in a German village now, where a bedding ceremony has the couple escorted to their marriage bed by rowdy guests chanting blessings, or bawdy jokes. You're blushing as Hugh and Marie are half-dragged to a straw mattress, the crowd ensuring the marriage is sealed. In England, you're hearing about rough music, where neighbors banged pots to shame couples who skipped traditional rites. You're imagining trying to sleep through that racket. Good luck. These quirks weren't just fun. They tied the couple to the community, making marriage everyone's business. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval villager, tossing apples at Hugh for luck and accidentally knocking out the priest. Sorry, father. The truth is, customs varied by class too. You're at a noble wedding now, where the feast includes rare spices and jugglers, the bride draped in silks from Venice. Peasants like Marie and Hugh got simpler rites, but their rituals, like tying ribbons to symbolize fidelity, carried just as much heart. You're seeing how these traditions, fancy or humble, made marriages a shared story, not a private vow. The church tried to standardize things. You're back with Marie, watching the priest insist their bread-sharing happens at the church door, not in a field. Canon law demanded uniformity, but locals clung to their quirks. In one 14th century case, a Welsh couple was fined for a pagan ritual involving a bonfire, too wild for the church's taste. You're feeling the tension. Communities wanted their flavor, but the church wanted control. You're wondering how many couples snuck in a forbidden dance or two just to spite the priest. Let's giggle one more time. Imagine you're Marie, hiding Hugh's hat instead of your shoes, just to mess with him. Classic. As you leave this scene, you're carrying a new truth. Medieval marriage customs were as diverse as the people, weaving local pride into every vow. But why did so many avoid marrying young? Let's slip into the final village to uncover the reasons behind delaying marriage. You're trudging along a windswept path in a medieval village, the air crisp with the scent of autumn leaves and baking bread, as you watch a woman in her mid-20s, call her Edith, haggling over turnips in the market. She's not rushing to the altar, and neither are most folks around her. The myth of everyone marrying young in the Middle Ages is crumbling before your eyes, and you're about to uncover why delaying marriage was often the smartest move in this world of hard labor and fragile survival. It's not about romance or rebellion, it's about staying alive, and you're realizing that tying the knot too early could be a gamble you wouldn't survive. Let's ground this with a mainstream fact. Contrary to popular belief, many medieval Europeans, especially peasants, married later than we think, often in their 20s. Records from 14th-century England, like tax rolls and parish registers, show women typically wed between 20 and 25, men closer to 25 or 30. You're watching Edith, 24, still working her family's plot, her labor too valuable to lose to an early marriage. For peasants, delaying meant more years to save resources or learn skills, boosting their odds of a stable household. You're seeing why rushing to the altar wasn't always the plan. Now, for a quirky tidbit that'll make you smile. In some English villages, young women held spinning parties to pool resources for their eventual dowries, delaying marriage until they'd woven enough cloth to impress a suitor. Picture your Edith, giggling with friends as you spin wool by candlelight, each thread a step toward a better match. It's practical but oddly cozy, and you're chuckling at the thought of a suitor being wooed by a pile of neatly spun yarn. These gatherings weren't just social, they were economic strategy, buying time for a stronger start. Historians still argue whether delaying marriage was a choice or a necessity. You're with Edith now, as she brushes off a neighbor's nudge about a local bachelor. Some scholars say later marriages gave people agency, letting them build skills or wealth before committing. Others argue it was forced by poverty. Families couldn't afford dowries or spare workers. You're leaning toward necessity. Edith's family needs her hands in the fields, but you're impressed by her quiet confidence, knowing she's biding her time for a better deal. Let's toss in a laugh. Imagine you're a medieval parent trying to marry off Edith, only to hear she's too busy perfecting her bread recipe. Tough sell. But seriously, delaying had real benefits. You're slipping into a village now, where young men like Edith's brother, 27 and still single, work as hired hands to save for a plot before marrying. Early marriage meant early kids, and more mouths to feed on a thin harvest. You're seeing why waiting made sense. Records show smaller households with older parents often had better survival rates during famines. The economic logic is brutal. You're at a tavern, overhearing a farmer explain why his daughter's still unmarried at 22. She's their best weaver, and losing her to a husband's household would tank their income. For peasants, marriage wasn't just about love or even alliances. It was about timing. Marry too young, and you're stretched thin. Wait, and you might afford an extra cow. You're recalling Agnes and Peter from earlier, who married in their 20s to merge resources wisely. You're imagining pitching financial planning to these folks. They'd nod like it's obvious. Here's another chuckle. Picture you, a medieval matchmaker, trying to hype a groom who's almost saved enough for a pig. Dreamy, right? The truth is, nobles delayed too, but for different reasons. You're at a castle now, where a lord's son, 28, holds off marrying to secure a fatter dowry or a better title. Child betrothals happened, like Cecily's back in that grim noble hall, but actual weddings often waited. Nobles needed their heirs healthy, not rushed. You're struck by how both classes played the long game, even if the stakes differed. The church had a hand in this too. You're at a sermon, where a priest's preaching that marriage is for mature souls, ready to serve God and family. He's not wrong. Older couples were better equipped for kids and chores. but you're cringing at his side eye toward young lovers, warning against hasty unions. The church liked stability, and late marriages meant fewer annulments or scandals. You're thinking of Beatrice, who fought for her annulment. She'd have been better off waiting like Edith. You're imagining explaining dating apps to this priest. He'd probably burn his pulpit. Let's giggle one last time. Imagine you're Edith, dodging a suitor by saying you're married to your loom. Savage. The social payoff's clear. You're watching Edith's village thrive because folks like her wait, building stronger households that lift everyone. Delayed marriages meant fewer kids born into hunger, more hands for harvests. Even nobles benefited. Later weddings meant better alliances, like Isabel the widow leveraging her freedom. You're seeing why waiting was a quiet rebellion against a world pushing for early vows. As the village fades, the firelight softens, and the hum of the market grows distant. You're sinking into the quiet of the night, the weight of these medieval lives settling around you like a warm blanket. Marriages, whether for love, duty, or survival, wove the fabric of this world, and you've walked its threads, from child brides to cunning widows, from binding betrothals to risky affairs. The reasons to delay, rooted in the struggle to survive, echo in the choices of Edith and countless others. Their stories linger, not as grand tales of romance, but as whispers of resilience, fading into the crackle of a dying hearth. Let the lessons of their lives drift with you, carrying you gently into dreams.